Dust curled behind the horse's hooves as Samuel Creed rode into the outskirts of Cedar Hollow, his jaw tight and his eyes dull. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, and he hadn't, not really. Sleep had turned into something that mocked him every time he tried to lay his head down. The dreams came in like thieves, breaking him apart with memories of his late wife, Mary, and their unborn child. It had been 7 months since the accident, and still, he couldn't bring himself to stop riding, to stay put, to breathe right. A part of him still blamed himself. He should have made her stay home that day. He should have insisted, but he hadn't. And now, here he was, drifting through strange towns like a ghost with skin on. The land stretched wide and open, the air sharp with early autumn. The plains seemed to whisper secrets too heavy for words. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked. Just a smattering of buildings, a general store, a saloon, and some boarded-up homes that looked like they'd given up years ago. Samuel hadn't planned to stop, but his gelding had thrown a shoe somewhere along the canyon pass. The man he'd met along the way, an old rancher named Trask, told him a man named Brody Denton sold horses just outside town, toward the dry creek. Samuel didn't want another horse, not really. What he wanted was to stop the noise in his head. What he needed was a reason not to ride off the edge of the world. Buying a horse just gave him an excuse to be somewhere, doing something that didn't make him feel like he was unraveling. He passed the saloon without looking in. Music and laughter spilled out of it like smoke, but it didn't reach his soul. Nothing did anymore. He moved on, the sun slanting behind him, throwing long shadows that made the town feel hollow, like a place where too many people had left and not enough had come back. He found a den in place about half a mile from the main road. The fence was falling apart, patched up with rope and rusted wire. The barn leaned hard to one side like it was tired of standing. A dozen horses stood in a corral, ribs showing, eyes dull. It wasn't what Samuel had expected, but he dismounted anyway, more out of habit than purpose. There was no sign of Brody Denton, though the house door was wide open, swinging lightly in the breeze. Samuel approached it slow. Something felt off, the kind of off that made a man's gut twist. "Hello." His voice cracked in the dry air. Silence. He stepped in the house, boots echoing against the warped wood floor. Dust floated in the sunlight. Furniture was overturned. There was a smell, faint but sharp, like blood gone dry. He backed out, unease climbing his spine. Maybe Denton had been drunk and wandered off. Maybe the man was inside somewhere, passed out. But something about the place told Samuel this wasn't just neglect, it was abandonment. As he turned to head toward the barn, he heard it. A sound. Small. Quick. Like a gasp cut short. He froze. The wind rustled through the dying cornstalks, but that wasn't it. That was too natural. What he'd heard was something alive. Trapped. Afraid. He stepped quietly, following the faint noise past the edge of the barn, around to the back near a line of old crates and rusting farm tools. And then he saw it. A cage. Not meant for animals. Too small. Crude. Thrown together with barbed wire and iron sheets. Inside, 2 children. A girl and a boy. Maybe 5 or 6 years old. Thin. Dirty. Faces smudged with dried tears and dust. The girl's dress was torn down one side. The boy was barefoot, clutching the girl's hand so tight their knuckles were white. Samuel's heart slammed once in his chest and then held still. They didn't scream. They just looked at him like they didn't know if he was real or not. He stepped forward slow. "It's all right," he said, voice low. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl flinched anyway. The boy tried to pull her back, deeper into the corner of the cage, even though there was nowhere left to go. "Where's your folks?" Samuel asked, crouching down. "Who put you in there?" The girl opened her mouth, then closed it. Her lips were cracked. She looked like she hadn't had water in days. She glanced at the barn and then back to Samuel. That was when he knew. Whoever had done this, whoever had locked up these children, might still be around. Watching. Waiting. Samuel stood quickly, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. He backed away from the cage, eyes scanning the field, the barn, the trees beyond. It was too quiet, too still. Something had happened here. Something bad. And now he was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. He stepped to the cage again, trying to loosen the twisted wire without cutting his hands. "I want to get you out of there, all right?" he said. The boy finally spoke. Just one word. "Don't." Samuel froze. "Why not?" The girl looked to the barn again, a fresh wave of tears filling her eyes. "He said he'd come back," she whispered, "if we scream or run. He said he'd bury us like Mama." Samuel's stomach dropped. He didn't ask any more questions. He ripped the top layer of the cage apart, careful but fast. Lifted the boy out first, then the girl. They were light. Too light. Like they'd been starving for a long time. "Come on," he said. "We're leaving." They clung to him, arms tight around his middle. He didn't know how far they could walk. He didn't know how much time they had. But he knew this. If that man came back, there'd be no more talking. And Samuel Creed wasn't ready to bury any more children. He got them to his horse, lifting them one by one into the saddle. The girl looked back at the barn the whole time, her little hands trembling against the horn of the saddle. Samuel mounted behind them, arms around both. He kicked the gelding into a trot, then a gallop once they hit the road. Dust rose up like ghosts behind them. He didn't know who the man was, or why he'd done what he did, but someone in Cedar Hollow knew. And Samuel Creed wasn't riding away this time. He was riding back. The general store sat quiet under the midday sun, its wooden porch shaded by a weather-warped awning that creaked with every shift of the wind. Samuel stopped just shy of it, his horse lathered with sweat and the two children clinging to him like a shadow. They hadn't spoken much since he'd pulled them from that cage. The boy, who finally said his name was Wes, kept darting looks at every stranger they passed, expecting violence in every movement. The girl, May, said nothing at all. She just gripped the saddle horn with small, shaking hands, eyes hollow and locked on some memory she couldn't speak of. Inside the store, the bell jingled softly as Samuel pushed through the door. An older woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes sharp but tired. She wore her hair pinned back tight, and her hands were busy measuring out sugar into small paper bags. When she saw the children, her face froze. Samuel didn't wait. "They need water. Food, too, if you got it." She nodded once and disappeared into the back without a word. While they waited, a man stepped through the curtain that separated the back room from the storefront. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, a scar running down one side of his jaw. His badge glinted under the light from the window. "Sheriff Tom Kinley." "You're not from here," he said, voice steady but unreadable. "No," Samuel replied, "but I found something that belongs to your town." Tom looked at the kids. His eyes narrowed just slightly. They were locked in a cage behind the den place. A long silence stretched between them. The air felt thick, like something unspoken was pressing down on walls. Tom crossed his arms. "Denton's been gone a week. Folks figured he just rode out. He's known to disappear when the whiskey dries up." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You didn't go look?" "We did. Found his house empty, like you said. Thought maybe he sold his stock and ran." "You missed the cage." Tom's jaw tensed. "Wasn't nothing behind that barn when we went. Just junk and a busted plow." The woman returned then, setting down a tray with bread, jerky, and 2 tin cups of water. The kids went to it like wild things, and Samuel had to place a hand gently on Wes's back to keep him from choking. Tom watched all of it. His eyes moved from Samuel to the children, and something passed through his face. Disbelief mixed with something harder to name. "You'll need to give a statement," he said, tone clipped, "after the kids get seen by Doc Hill." Samuel nodded. "Fine, but I'm not leaving them." "Didn't say you had to." The sheriff stepped outside, but Samuel knew it wasn't over. The kind of quiet, the kind that wore a badge and spoke in half-truths, always meant there was more going on than met the eye. Later that evening, they took the children to the doctor's house, a small cottage tucked behind the schoolhouse. Doc Hill was a wiry man with kind eyes and a voice like sandpaper. He asked no questions when he saw the children. He just got to work, checking their wounds, counting bruises, noting how malnourished they were. "They've been through hell," he muttered to Samuel after. "That girl's back has scars that aren't fresh. Someone's been hurting them for a long time." Samuel's stomach churned. Doc leaned in close then, his voice lower. "Be careful with the law around here." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Denon wasn't the only man in this town with a mean streak. And some folks would rather keep quiet about things that don't shine well on Cedar Hollow." Samuel didn't answer, but he didn't forget the words either. Over the next 2 days, word spread like fire. The children, the cage, the outsider who rode in and stirred up old ghosts. That's when he met Elsie Carr. She worked in the schoolhouse, taught reading to children who barely knew their own names. She was young, quiet, with a stubborn mouth and dark hair always tied back with a faded blue ribbon. She came to the doctor's house after hearing about May and Wes, bringing books and a soft blanket that smelled like lavender. At first, the children wouldn't go near her, but Elsie didn't rush them. She just sat on the floor, read aloud, voice slow and warm. After a while, May started inching closer. Then Wes followed. Samuel watched from the porch, arms crossed, unsure how to feel. Part of him wanted to trust her. Another part had forgotten how. Elsie stood beside him that night, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You care about them," she said. He didn't reply. She looked up at him. "So do I." Later, as the stars blinked in a place above them, she told him what no one else had. Denton used to work for Mr. Creedon. Owns half the ranches in this county. Men like Denton don't survive long on their own. Someone was feeding him, paying him, keeping him quiet. Sheriff Kinley? He's Creedon's cousin. That's why nothing ever stuck to Denton, no matter how many times folks whispered. Samuel turned to her slowly. "You're saying there's more." "I'm saying Denton wasn't the only one who knew about that cage." The next morning, Samuel went to the sheriff's office to give his statement. Tom took it down in silence, only asking the bare minimum. When Samuel tried to mention the kid's injuries, the sheriff cut him off. "Already talked to document. We'll investigate. You've done your part." "You really think that's all I came to do?" Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes hard. "You came to buy a horse. You found something awful. You helped. Now let the law do the rest." Samuel didn't like the way he said that. Like it was all wrapped up now. Like the cage had already been forgotten. As he left, he passed a man leaning against the post outside. Clean shaven, too clean. Fine boots. Watching him. "Creed, right?" the man asked, smiling. Samuel turned. "Do I know you?" "Name's Elias Creedon. You are my family's land, I hear." Samuel stared. "That was your land?" "Technically. Brody Denton was a tenant. Let's just say he let it fall apart. You know what he was doing out there?" Elias smiled again, but it didn't touch his eyes. "That's what the sheriff's for." Samuel didn't say another word. He just walked away, but the burn in his chest got deeper. That night, Elsie told him more. About other children who'd gone missing. About women too scared to talk. About how money can make a town blind. Wes finally spoke up too. Said Denton wasn't the only man who came. There were others. One with a gold tooth. Another with a scar on his wrist. Samuel listened, heart pounding. The town wasn't just ignoring evil. They were protecting it. The more he asked, the more doors closed. The general store clerk turned cold. The blacksmith, once friendly, now nodded without a word. And the sheriff? He stopped answering questions altogether. But Samuel didn't stop. He started asking around, visiting ranch hands, stable boys, anyone who'd worked near the den place. Some looked away. Others offered pieces, bits of truth wrapped in fear. It became clear the children were part of something bigger. A secret that had roots too deep for one man to pull out alone. Still, he couldn't walk away. Because every time May flinched at a sudden sound, or Wes froze when someone raised their voice, Samuel remembered what helplessness felt like. He knew he couldn't fix the past, but he wasn't about to let Cedar Hollow bury the truth. Not this time. Rain began to fall late in the afternoon, soft at first, then heavier, turning the dirt roads of Cedar Hollow into slick tracks of mud. Samuel Creed stood under the porch roof of Doc Hill's place, arms crossed as he watched the gray sky swallow the horizon. Inside, Wes and May huddled near the fire, wrapped in the quilt Elsie had brought. They still didn't talk much, but they clung to Samuel when he moved too far from them, like he was the only thing left between them and a world that had tried to erase them. The silence of the town was growing louder. People avoided him now. Conversations died when he walked into the store or leaned against the well in front of the saloon. No one said anything outright, but their eyes said enough. He was a problem they didn't ask for, a wound they didn't want reopened. The tension finally cracked the day someone broke into Doc Hill's cottage. It happened in the early hours, while everyone slept. The door was kicked in. Furniture overturned. The room where May and Wes slept had been rifled through, the blankets tossed, drawers emptied, and a single note pinned to the wall with a knife. "They don't belong to you." Samuel's blood ran cold. Doc Hill swore under his breath, pacing the floor with a shotgun in hand. Elsie arrived just after dawn, hair undone, eyes wild. "They try to take them," she whispered. Samuel looked her dead in the eyes. "They're not safe here." The sheriff came later, slow and unconcerned, asking a few questions without writing anything down. "Could have been a drifter," he offered, "or someone trying to scare you off." Samuel didn't buy it. The kids had been silent since the break-in. They stared at the wall like she couldn't see it. Wes had started chewing his fingernails raw again. They knew something, but they were too scared to say it out loud. That afternoon, Elsie told Samuel about the barn behind the Creedon Ranch. "They've got workers in and out, mostly men from outside town. No one asks questions. I've seen children there before, little ones. They say they're Hands kids, but none of the Hands ever bring them into town. They don't go to school. They don't play." Samuel's jaw clenched. "You think it's where they came from?" "I think it's where they're going back to." That night, he rode out alone, leaving Doc and Elsie with the kids. The Creedon Ranch was vast, stretching across acres of hills and grassland. But the barn stood out, a long, low structure behind the main house, lit dimly by a lantern inside. He stayed in the shadow of the trees, watching. He didn't have to wait long. A wagon pulled up, covered with a tarp. Two men got out, one short, one tall, both dressed in black slickers despite the dry weather. They unloaded something from the back, dragging it inside. A child. Samuel's stomach turned. He reached for the rifle strapped across his back, but stopped. He was outnumbered, and worse, he didn't know who was inside. If he went in blind, the child wouldn't be the only one hurt. He rode back to town at dawn and found Elsie waiting, worry etched into every line of her face. "It's real," he said simply. She didn't look surprised. "I need help," he told her. "Someone who knows the land. Someone who's not afraid." That's what she led him to Jonah Teague. Jonah was an old trapper who lived up near the ridgeline, mostly alone except for his dog and a battered rifle. He'd once worked as a scout during the war, and rumor had it he was part Comanche. People left him alone, partly out of fear, partly because he preferred it that way. Samuel didn't expect a warm welcome, and he didn't get one. Jonah squinted at him, chewing on a sprig of pine. "What you want from me?" he asked, voice deep and rough. Samuel told him everything, from the cage to the wagon to the break-in. When he finished, Jonah just nodded slowly. "New Denton was trash," he said. "Didn't know it ran all the way up the mountain. You'll help." Jonah looked away toward the trees. "Ain't for your sake. It's for the kids." The plan was simple but dangerous. That night, Samuel and Jonah would circle the Creedon property. Samuel would keep eyes on the barn, while Jonah followed the creek that led behind it. If there were more children inside, Jonah would get them out through the back. But before night fell, another problem rose. Doc Hill came to the cottage with blood on his sleeve. "Sheriff's posted men around town," he said. "Said it's for protection, but they're watching you." "Why now?" Samuel asked. "Because someone talked." And they had. Elsie found out that afternoon. One of the stable boys, 16, scared, had mentioned to Creedon that Samuel was asking questions. but he'd been seen near the barn. Creedon had tightened his grip. Now the whole town was part of it, whether they liked it or not. Samuel felt the walls closing in. But what none of them knew, not Creedon, not the sheriff, was that the kids were remembering. Slowly, painfully, that evening, Wes asked Samuel, "If I tell you what happened, will you still keep us?" Samuel bent down beside him. No matter what. Wes took a long breath. Didn't had a boss. He said his name once, Creedon. He said if we were quiet, we'd go to the big house where the others were. The ones that didn't scream anymore. Samuel's blood ran cold. What others? Wes looked down. He said they already sold my sister once. But she bit a man's hand, and he brought her back. Samuel barely held himself together. That night, it all snapped into place. This wasn't just one sick man. This was a ring. Men like Denton collecting children, sending them up the ladder to Creedon and whoever else paid to look the other way. He couldn't go to the sheriff. He couldn't even trust the preacher. Creedon had hands everywhere. So he rode with Jonah. They left as the sky turned deep blue, riding without words. Jonah veered off halfway to the ranch, melting into the shadows. Samuel took the ridge path and staked out the barn again. Same wagon, same men. Only this time, he recognized one. The man with the gold tooth. Wes had mentioned him. Samuel's hands trembled around his rifle. The barn doors swung open and he caught a glimpse. 4 children huddled inside, near the wall. No adults watching them. He took that chance. He crept close, then closer, until he reached the side window. Inside, 2 of the men were arguing over money. The children were alone. That's when the trap sprang. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Another hit him across the face. The world tilted. Samuel fought, teeth gritted, fists swinging. But they were ready for him. Creedon himself stepped into view, calm as a Sunday morning. "You just couldn't leave it alone," he said. Samuel spat blood. "You're gonna burn for this." Creedon chuckled. "I've been paying this town's bills since before you learned to ride. You think one drifter's gonna bring it down?" Samuel was dragged inside, thrown to the dirt. Creedon walked slowly to the children. "They'll forget you," he said, "like all the others." That's when a shot rang out. Jonah. The window exploded. 1 man dropped. Chaos erupted. Samuel lunged, slamming into the nearest guard. Jonah moved fast, a blur of motion, grabbing the children and hurting them out the back. One of the men tried to stop him. Jonah shot him in the leg without slowing down. Samuel fought to his feet, grabbed his rifle, and pointed it straight at Creedon. "Get on your knees." Creedon hesitated, then smiled. "Won't matter," he said. "Even if you kill me, the law's still mine." But Samuel didn't shoot. He dragged Creedon out into the night, tied him to the wagon, and rode back to town with Jonah and the children in tow. He didn't speak until they reached the sheriff's office. Then he kicked the door open and threw Creedon inside. "Let's see if your badge still means anything," Samuel said to Kinley. "Because if you don't arrest him right now, every man in this town will know what you are." Tom Kinley looked at Creedon, looked at the children, and said nothing. He opened the cell door. Creedon laughed all the way in. But that laugh was hollow now, because the town was watching. And for the first time in a long time, it was listening. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Rain had soaked the town overnight, leaving puddles in the streets and muddying the paths around the church and the schoolhouse. But it wasn't just the weather that felt uneasy. Cedar Hollow was changing. The children were safe, but the town was not. Word had spread faster than fire in dry brush. Samuel Creed had brought down Elias Creedon, the man who practically owned the place. And now everyone waited, anxious and watching, to see what would happen next. Samuel stood on the porch of Doc Hill's place, rifle by the door, eyes scanning every movement in the street. May and Wes were asleep inside, their sleep still restless and full of sudden cries. Elsie sat in a rocking chair nearby, arms wrapped around herself, gaze distant. Neither of them had spoken much since the night of the rescue. The truth had come out, yes, but the cost was still rising. Doc Hill returned from the sheriff's office just after dawn, boots caked in mud, coat pulled tight around him. Kinley released Creedon this morning, he said quietly. Said there wasn't enough to hold him. Samuel didn't respond at first. He just stared at the edge of the road, jaw locked so tight the muscle twitched. Elsie stood slowly. After everything, after those children, Doc held up a hand. Don't shoot the messenger. He's going to walk, Samuel said, voice low and bitter. After what he's done, unless you get someone to talk, someone official. But everyone's afraid, Elsie added. They've been afraid for years. Samuel ran a hand over his face, fingers digging into his eyes like he could rub away the anger burning behind them. If no one stands up now, they never will. It wasn't long before the retaliation began. That afternoon, someone poisoned Doc Hill's dog, left him shaking and foaming on the porch before dying in the dirt. The message was clear: don't meddle, or more will follow. Then the schoolhouse windows were smashed in, one after another, a rock thrown through each pane. Elsie found it the next morning, glass glittering like frost across the floor where she'd taught children to read. Her hands shook as she swept the shards away, lips pressed into a thin line. They're not hiding anymore, she whispered. They think fear will work again, Samuel said. Jonah came down from the hills the following night, slipping into town like a shadow. He brought news. I followed one of Creedon's men out past the canyon. He's meeting someone. Late-night deliveries. Ain't livestock. Samuel knew what that meant. Even if the ring in Cedar Hollow had been cracked, others might still be operating just outside its reach. This wasn't a wound that healed overnight. It was a sickness that ran down into the ground. He wanted to burn it out, every last piece. But his focus had to stay on Creedon for now. Elsie stepped closer, voice tight with fear. If he walks, what do we tell the children? That monsters win if they have enough money. Samuel looked at her for a long time. No, we tell them monsters bleed too. But his words rang hollow that evening when he found May hiding under the bed, curled into herself and shaking. She wouldn't let anyone touch her. She wouldn't speak. Samuel had to sit on the floor beside her for an hour, talking soft, promising she was safe. Promising over and over again, even though he couldn't be sure. Wes, too, had grown quieter. He no longer played with the little carved horse Elsie had given him. He simply stared out the window, watching every rider who passed, expecting one to be the man who came back to take him. Samuel's heart broke a little more every day. That's when Elsie confronted him. We can't protect them like this, she said, voice trembling. They need a future, a home, not a constant lookout. You think I don't know that? He snapped, harsher than he meant. She flinched, and he regretted it instantly. But she didn't walk away. Instead, she stepped closer. I know your heart, Samuel. I know you'd die for them. But what if they need you to live for them instead? He couldn't answer that. He'd spent so long chasing ghosts, running from what happened to Mary, that he didn't know how to live without grief holding the reins. Later that night, he stared at the stars, remembering his wife's laughter, the way she used to braid her hair in the mornings, humming some hymn he could never name. The child they lost had never taken a breath, but Samuel felt that absence like a scar. He had tried to bury love with the dead. Now here it was again, in the trembling voice of a girl, in the haunted eyes of a boy, in the strength of a woman who refused to back down. Love had come back, but it brought pain with it. Still, Samuel made his decision. He went back to the sheriff's office the next morning. Creedon was gone, of course, nowhere to be found. Kinley just sat behind his desk, pretending to shuffle papers. You know who he is, Samuel said. The sheriff didn't look up. You've always known. Still no reply. Samuel walked slowly to the desk. You were a good man once. You joined the law because you believed in something. Kinley finally looked at him. You think I had a choice? You always had a choice. You just stopped making the right one. The sheriff's eyes darted toward the window. You don't understand how deep this goes. There are men bigger than Creedon. Men who will kill anyone that threatens the system. Samuel leaned forward. Then start small. Arrest the ones you can. Kinley looked torn. His hand hovered over his holster, not in threat, but as if it reminded him of what he was supposed to be. I'll need proof, he said finally. I've got children who remember every face. They won't testify. Samuel nodded. Then I will. Jonah returned the next day with what Samuel needed, a ledger. Found buried in the floor of the barn. Names, dates, sums of money. At least 5 children, listed by initials and coded numbers. Creedon's handwriting matched his ranch books. Doc Hill confirmed it. And Jonah recognized 2 of the buyers' names from a bounty job years back. That was enough to shake things loose. But it wasn't over. That night, the cottage was set on fire. Flames tore through the walls like they'd been soaked in kerosene. Elsie barely got the children out before the roof collapsed. Jonah's dog dragged May through the yard by her sleeve. Doc was burned on his hands, trying to pull his records from the back room. Samuel didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just grabbed his gun and rode toward the Creedon ranch. But it was empty, cleared out, like they'd been warned. Samuel returned at sunrise, beaten by frustration. He found Elsie standing in front of the ashes, Wes holding her hand, May beside them, her face streaked with soot. They're still alive, she said. We are too. Samuel looked down at them, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel hollow. They won't win, he said, but he knew they'd have to fight harder now, because with Creedon gone, there was a power vacuum, and men even worse were circling like vultures. Jonah rode to the next county to speak with the federal marshal. Doc worked day and night collecting statements. Samuel taught Wes how to shoot a slingshot. Elsie kept the children reading, and each night, Samuel stayed awake by the door, one hand on his rifle, the other resting gently on the edge of a blanket shared between 2 children who had every reason to give up, but hadn't. Because now, they had someone who wouldn't let them. The wind shifted sharply 2 days after the fire, bringing cooler air from the mountains. The ruins of a doctor's cottage still smoked faintly, charred beams jutting out like bones from the ash. The town of Cedar Hollow tried to return to its rhythm, but the silence in the streets said otherwise. Folks no longer gossiped on the store porch or lingered in the saloon after sundown. Something had broken loose, and it was too big to bury. Samuel stood at the edge of the rubble with Doc Hill and Elsie, his face unreadable. Wes clung to Elsie's hand, while May kept her eyes down, her mouth set in a tight, silent line. The fire had shaken them all, but the children wore it differently, like it was just one more blow from a world that never stopped swinging. Jonah returned from the north that evening, riding in hard and fast. His face was pale under the dust, his eyes darker than usual. They're not just selling children, he said once they were alone in the rebuilt schoolhouse. They're moving them across counties. Creedon's not the top. He's middle of the chain. There's someone bigger pulling strings. Samuel clenched his jaw. Names? Jonah nodded. Marshall I met said a man named Burke is behind most of the operations west of the Red River. Real name's Martin Burke. Owns freight routes. Disguises human cargo as cattle shipments. He's got buyers out east. Doc sat down heavily, his hands trembling. We're not just dealing with a ring. This is trafficking. Creedon was keeping records to protect himself, Jonas said. If he was ever caught, he had leverage. Samuel looked at the ledger again, now stained with smoke but still legible. And at the bottom, a list of initials, WJ, MJ, AG. Those were Wes and May. The others, they might still be out there. It was Elsie who finally spoke. Then we bring Creedon in, publicly, and use the records. And if he runs? Doc asked. If he hides behind Burke? Samuel met her eyes. Then we burn the whole thing down to get him. But things weren't so simple. That night, the betrayal came. Sheriff Tom Kinley left town. No warning. Just disappeared. Left behind an empty office, a cleaned-out drawer, and a letter nailed to the door. Do not follow. Some things are too big for this town. You want justice? Take it yourselves. It wasn't a confession. It was a surrender. And it changed everything. Samuel read it in silence, then handed it to Jonah. He was the only law left here. Now there's nothing but us. Jonah didn't look surprised. Then we act like it. The next morning, Doc Hill rode out to contact federal authorities. He carried the ledger, sworn statements, and photographs of the children's injuries. They all knew he might not make it back. Burke had men everywhere, and word could travel fast. Samuel stayed behind to protect the children. But it wasn't just protection anymore. It was purpose. Wes had begun talking again, asking questions, watching everything Samuel did. May started humming when she was nervous, some old song their mother must have sung. And each time they looked at him with trust in their eyes, he felt something in him anchor back into place. Then came the letter from Creedon, delivered by a courier boy with shaking hands, scrawled in sharp, deliberate strokes. You bring this public, the rest of them die. You have no idea who you're playing with. Underneath was a list of names. 4 children, ages, genders, a warning. Samuel crumpled it slowly. I'm going after him, he said. Elsie grabbed his arm. Then I'm going too. He looked at her. This isn't your fight. Her eyes didn't waver. It became mine the moment I saw what he did to them. Jonah added simply, he won't be alone. Neither will you. They left that night. Samuel, Elsie, Jonah, riding through the darkness like ghosts. They tracked Creedon to a roadhouse north of the county line, a place that catered to men with no names and heavy pockets. The kind of place you didn't walk into unless you had something worth dying for. Samuel had too. They entered just before dawn, rifles low, eyes sweeping the room. Jonah had already cleared the back exit. Elsie waited outside with the horses, gun in her lap, jaw set. Creedon sat in the corner, alone. He didn't flinch when he saw them, just poured another drink and raised his glass like they were old friends. You really want to die here, Creed? Samuel asked, voice low. I've already died in this world, Creedon said. What's left now is survival. You sold children. I sold hope, he snapped. To men who can't feel, can't love. You think it'd stop with me? You think Burke gives a damn what happens in some godforsaken town? Jonah raised his gun. We're not asking. That's when Creedon leaned forward and smiled. You want redemption? You want to save those kids? Burke's holding them at Ridge Hollow. Old lumberyard. End of the freight line. You'll be dead before you get through the gate. Samuel stepped closer. Then die knowing we'll try. Creedon's smirk faltered just slightly. Then Samuel knocked him cold. They tied him to the saddle and rode straight for Ridge Hollow. It wasn't just vengeance now. It was war. The sun rose bloody red behind them as the freight yard came into view. Rows of rotting timber buildings, tracks littered with broken carts, a large warehouse looming at the end. Burke's men were there, armed, waiting. Samuel and Jonah scouted the perimeter. Elsie kept watch on Creedon. There were at least 7 men guarding the warehouse, possibly more inside. No law, no backup, just them. Samuel turned to Jonah. You sure? Jonah nodded once. You? Samuel looked toward the warehouse and heard Wes's laugh in his head. May's humming. I've never been more sure of anything. They attacked just before sundown. A distraction at the south fence. A fire set in the woodpile. Jonah picked off the first 2 men from the tree line. Samuel broke through the west door while Elsie circled around with a stolen rifle. The warehouse was chaos. Screams, smoke, gunfire. Inside, they found the children, 3 girls, 1 boy, locked in a metal cage. And Burke, older than Samuel expected, well-dressed, calm. You don't know what you're doing, he said, raising his hands. Saving lives, Samuel replied. Burke laughed. You think this stops anything? There are others. They'll come. They'll replace us. Samuel didn't speak. He just fired. Burke collapsed, stunned, a bullet in his thigh. Jonah kicked the rifle away. They took the children, left the bodies, rode fast and hard through the night, Creedon groaning behind them, the rescued children too dazed to speak. When they returned to Cedar Hollow, the town gathered in silence. They had proof now, living children, names, ledgers. One trafficker dead, another in chains. And finally, after 3 days, Doc returned, with U.S. Marshals behind him. Creedon was taken. Burke's operation was exposed. The freight lines were seized. More children found. But it wasn't a clean ending. Nothing about it was. Samuel stood by Mary's grave that week, the wind blowing through the grass like a song. He spoke softly. "I couldn't save you, but I saved them. I think maybe you'd be proud." Behind him, May and Wes waited by the tree line with Elsie. Samuel turned, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. A real one, because love hadn't died with grief. It had risen from it. Cedar Hollow never truly went back to what it had been before. Too much had surfaced. Too many truths had clawed their way out of the dark, leaving the townspeople to decide what kind of place they wanted to live in now. The saloon still opened every night. The general store still sold flour and nails, but people walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, looked each other in the eyes a little longer, wondering what they'd missed, what they'd allowed to go unseen for too long. Samuel Creed stayed. At first, it wasn't a decision, it just happened. Day by day, he kept riding out to the edge of the land, checking fence lines, looking over his shoulder less and less. He slept near the children's room on the floor, even after Elsie moved them into the safe house behind the school, because he didn't trust the world not to steal them again. May still had nightmares, but she no longer screamed. Wes would wake up and sit beside her silently until she fell back asleep. They'd learned early how to hold each other together. Samuel just made sure now they never had to do it alone. The marshals came and went, rounding up men connected to Burke's operation. More names appeared in the ledgers, some from towns nearby, some far away. A network that had thrived because of silence was now unraveling, because a widower with nothing to lose had refused to keep his mouth shut. Samuel never called himself a hero, and no one in town called him one either. But the glances changed, the tight nods of respect, the occasional hand on the shoulder from an old rancher who'd once looked right through him. People saw him now, not the ghost of Mary's husband, not the drifter, just a man who had done the thing others had been too scared to. Elsie grew in her voice too. She took in 3 more children who'd been rescued from Ridge Hollow, each one quiet, all too familiar with pain. She built a second schoolhouse with the help of Samuel and Doc Hill, and she taught them all, reading, writing, and how to trust. May stayed close to her, never far from her skirts. Wes followed Samuel like a shadow, asking more questions each day, wanting to know how to mend a fence, how to polish a rifle, how to keep something safe. Doc Hill retired not long after, his hands too stiff from the burns to work the way they used to. He moved into the back room of the schoolhouse, writing letters to Washington, testifying in trials, sending reports with names of missing children who'd never come home. He said he had one good fight left in him, and this was it. Creedon stood trial in the state capitol. His lawyers tried everything. Denial, discrediting the ledger, blaming Burke, who was already dead. But none of it held. The jury didn't take long. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. The day the news came, Samuel didn't say a word. He just walked out to the tree where Mary used to sit reading and stared at the sky for a long while. "I think we're free," he whispered. But even freedom had its weight. The scars didn't vanish. Not for May, who still jerked at the sound of metal scraping wood. Not for Wes, who couldn't stand the sight of padlocks. Not for Samuel, who sometimes woke in the night reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, heart pounding like it had when a fire stole their home. One afternoon, Wes asked Samuel why Mary wasn't buried in the cemetery with the others. Samuel hesitated. "Because I buried her myself," he said. "Didn't want strangers near her." Wes thought about that, then nodded like it made perfect sense. "She would have liked you," Samuel added. "She would have liked May too, especially May." It was May, in fact, who gave him back something he never thought he'd have again. She brought him a crumpled drawing one morning. It was crude, stick figures on a hill, one taller, two smaller. The words "home" scratched into the sky. Samuel stared at it so long, his hands began to tremble. "Is that us?" he asked. May nodded. He hung it on the wall next to Mary's old shawl. They weren't his by blood, but they were his by choice. As spring crept in, bringing green buds to the trees and warmth to the soil, Samuel started planting. A garden behind the schoolhouse. Tomatoes, onions, a few beans. Wes helped. May watered everything like it was made of glass. Elsie brought herbs. They laughed more often. Not always. Not freely. But they laughed. One morning, Elsie found Samuel sitting on the back porch, sharpening a knife, eyes distant. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I used to think I'd die out there. Somewhere far, somewhere quiet. No one around to see it happen. And now," he looked at her. "Now I think maybe I was meant to live. Even if it hurts." She sat beside him, resting her hand on his. "You don't have to carry it all, you know." He met her gaze. "I think I do, but it helps knowing you're here." They sat like that for a long time, the sun climbing behind them, the schoolhouse quiet, the garden waking up with the morning breeze. A letter came weeks later, from a family back east, distant relatives of May and Wes. They'd seen this story in the paper, wanted to know if the children would come live with them. Samuel let them read it first. Wes held the envelope in his lap for a while, then handed it back. "Can we stay?" he asked. Samuel didn't speak. His throat tightened too much. He just nodded. The legal part took time. Papers, court orders, sign-offs. But eventually, Samuel became what he'd never thought he'd be again, a father. Not by accident, not by blood, by choice, by heart. One day, Samuel walked out to Mary's grave with May and Wes. He stood in silence, letting the children place wildflowers on the small wooden cross. "I used to think my life ended with her," he told them. Wes looked up. "But it didn't." Samuel shook his head. "No, I just had to walk through the fire to get here." May reached for his hand. And Samuel, for once, didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man returned. The town never gave him a statue. There were no medals. But people knew. When he walked into the store, men stepped aside. When Elsie took the children to church, women reached out to pat their heads. The schoolhouse was painted fresh every spring. The new garden fed the whole block. And no child in Cedar Hollow ever went missing again. Years later, when Wes asked why Samuel didn't tear down the old ruined barn behind the Denham property, he replied simply, "Some things need to stay broken, so we don't forget." They didn't forget, but they also didn't live inside the pain. They lived with it, around it, through it. That was the difference. And that, in the end, was enough. Because in a world that had tried to swallow them whole, they had chosen each other. Not out of duty, but out of love. And that love, quiet and stubborn, held stronger than the silence that once ruled the town. Even the wind had changed. Softer now, still carrying scars, but also laughter, the rustle of leaves, and the sound of children running barefoot through the dust. Alive, free,